Okay, we can go ahead. Through the prayers of our Holy Fathers, Lord Jesus Christ, our God, have mercy on us and save us. Amen. Actually, since Father preached about it, let's say, O Heavenly King, comforter of the Spirit of truth, who art everywhere present and fills all things, treasure of blessings and giver of life, come and abide in us, cleanse us of all stain, and save our souls, O good one. Amen. So, welcome back. This is the second in our liturgy series. As I explained last time, I have no end in sight. I'm thinking of Gene Wellman as Willy Wonka, right? And so shows no signs of slowing as he goes through the tunnel. But we're just going to march through the liturgy for however long it takes us to get through it. Last time we spoke a little bit about the history of liturgy, the roots of our liturgy in Old Testament worship and in the New Testament, and how the liturgy took its shape very, very early on in the history of the church. We saw some examples of that going back even to the first century, that the Christians worshipped in the same pattern that we see today. And then we spoke a little bit about what the liturgy is, and how we're to understand both the word liturgy and what we are doing when we worship. So today we'll begin with the actual rites of the liturgy proper, both the entrance prayers, or the preparatory prayers, and with the vesting of the clergy. So, first though, the first question is, why is preparation important? Oh, my battery may have finally died. Yeah. So why is preparation important or necessary? St. Simeon the New Theologian writes, "He who spends his whole life with groanings and tears is most worthy, not only on the feast day but every day, to partake daily of these divine mysteries." St. Macarius even wrote that among the monks in Egypt there was a rule that if you had not wept in your prayers in your cell, you were not prepared for Holy Communion. The preparation for Holy Communion, and in fact the liturgy itself, one could say, begins with the prayers that we say at home to prepare, right? Christ says in the Sermon on the Mount, if you are offering your gift at the altar and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother and then come and offer your gift. The first step of preparation, the first part of preparation, is to let go of our grudges and our resentments against others and to forgive from our heart. That is the first step and the most important step in preparation for the Divine Liturgy and for Holy Communion. We know from the Gospel and from so many writings of the saints that we should receive Holy Communion as often as we possibly can, but in a state of preparation. We do not go out of routine, out of obligation, out of this is just what we do. Certainly never out of embarrassment that what might people think if I don't go for communion, right? But rather, in a state of preparation, we go as approaching the Lord that we know is there. Christ says in John chapter 6, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life within you. We go forward to the fountain and source of our life. Remembering, nevertheless, St. Paul's injunction, who therefore eats the bread or drinks the cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner will be guilty concerning the body and blood of the Lord. St. Paul even goes on to say that some people in the Corinthian community, in the community of Corinth, have died by having gone and received without discerning the body and blood of the Lord. In other words, what you can summarize all of this to say is, as one priest put it, the magnitude of the gift that we receive at the Holy Chalice is directly proportional to our preparedness. If we prepare little, we receive little. We must come forward in a state of preparation. And it makes sense, right? Think about it. When we have somebody coming to visit our home, we run around and clean the house, and we prepare, and we put out the nice napkins and the nice china, and we get everything ready. Well, if the King of Glory is going to enter the temple of my heart, I should do at least a little bit of cleaning up. Right? So, I keep picking this up out of habit. Specifically as it relates to the clergy, St. Gregory the theologian says, "No one is worthy of the great God, who is at once victim and high priest, unless he has first presented himself to God as a living and holy sacrifice, or unless he has offered to God a sacrifice of praise and a broken spirit, the only sacrifice asked from us by him who has offered everything for us." The priest's ministry and his offering of the liturgy begins with the offering of his own broken heart. And this is true, brothers and sisters, for all of us, right? If we are to offer ourselves on the discos and become what we eat and truly be the body of Christ, then we have to first break that heart in the same way that the bread is broken before we can offer it to Christ. Elder Hieronymus of Egina, a more modern saint, once told a priest very naturally, as if it was nothing, "If you ever do not see your angel beside the holy table, then there's no point in celebrating the divine liturgy." Okay. I put that there to my own shame, but simply to remind us all what we're doing and what we're preparing for. It's a very natural thing. The entire church is filled with the heavenly host, as we talked about last time. We must go with a state of a state of heart that is appropriate, at minimum, right? If nothing else, saying as often as we can, "Forgive me, forgive me," right? In our car, as we drive to church, think about not turning anything on. Certainly not music that distracts us from things. Certainly not the news or our favorite podcast or the audiobook that we're listening to. Turn it all off. We're preparing. Take a few minutes. Forgive me, Lord. Forgive me. If you can find the prayers before communion that are in every Orthodox prayer book that I'm going to assume all of us have in our home, pray some of them. If it's too much, now granted, it takes literally only half an hour to say that. Okay? But if that's too much, if we find that that is too much for us, in one shot, either Saturday evening or Sunday morning, or whatever it is before communion, can we find a recording of it on YouTube and play it in the car on the way here? Can we play it in the house as we're getting ready, right? Can we, one of the great recommendations from Father Alexander Schmemann was split it up over a few days. And then you'll find in that same prayer book the prayers of thanksgiving for Holy Communion. So can you make, say, your morning prayers, or part of your morning prayers, from Thursday through Sunday, the prayers of preparation for communion, and then say Monday through Wednesday, the prayers of thanksgiving for communion. And then we actually orient our entire life around the Sunday Divine Liturgy, living our entire life in a prayer of both, in a state of both preparation and thanksgiving, but in a way that maybe doesn't feel quite so much all at once. That's one option. Anyway, these are all ideas of ways. These are tools. These prayers are tools to help teach our hearts where they should be, using the words of saints who had already found that place, right? Just some ideas. Obviously, I'm not a spiritual father to anyone, least of all to you. If you have questions about how to best prepare, have that conversation with the priest you confess with. Anyway, St. Basil has a list of instructions to priests, which is printed actually in some copies of the Liturgicon, the collection of liturgical prayers and services for the priest. Included among them, never stand at the synaxis. This is another word for the liturgy, the gathering. Never stand at the synaxis having hatred toward anyone, so as not to banish the Comforter. On the day of the synaxes, do not judge, do not argue, but remain praying and reading in the church until the appointed hour in which you will accomplish the divine and sacred ceremonies. And thus stand with compunction and purity of heart in the holy sanctuary, not looking around here and there, but standing with shuddering and fear before the heavenly King. Do not, because of human weakness, hasten through or cut short the prayers, neither try to please persons, but look only toward the King who is present and the host of angels that surround him. See in whose presence you stand, how you serve, and to whom you dispense. I think these particular instructions, while they may have been directed at the clergy by St. Basil, they really apply to all of us, don't they? There's a lot that we can take from this state of preparation. Ideally, we will find, I think of a couple that has a long-distance relationship in a sense, right? And maybe you only get to see each other once a week. Or maybe even not a long-distance relationship, you're just working and you're busy maybe, and you don't get to see each other all that often. But you know, Saturday or whatever it is, I'm going to get to see that person that I really love and I'm excited to see. And you may spend days in advance kind of thinking about that. I'm going to finally get to see them, right? If we cultivate this way of living, that becomes our entire life as it relates to Christ. So, understanding then all that the church tells us about the importance of preparation for Holy Communion and for participation in the Divine Liturgy. By the way, these, while it assumes that you're receiving Holy Communion, they don't specifically relate only to the days that I have Holy Communion. So this is part of the fallacy, right? Is that, okay, I'm going to be really holy and prepare on the days when I'm receiving communion, but then on the weeks when I'm not receiving communion, I can kind of slack off and I don't need to worry about it, right? Or I've slacked off and so I'm not going to receive communion. And the point of this is the Divine Liturgy itself is a participation in the kingdom. Do you have your wedding garment on? To use the words of the gospel, right? We prepare for liturgy whether or not we're receiving. But then if we prepared, we need to go forward. We should want to go forward, and we will. Does that make sense? It's not I'm only preparing for communion. If I'm not receiving, then I don't need to worry about it when I go to liturgy. We have to prepare no matter what. We're going to stand in the very presence of God himself in his throne room, right? We don't go in board shorts, metaphorically. So understanding all of this, right? The church has over time, and we see this developing by about the 13th or 14th century, a short service of preparation for the clergy themselves to say before any of the other parts of the Divine Liturgy. For the priest and the deacon generally, they will say it either before any of the other services start. So for example, when Father and I on Sunday will usually try to take, it's called keros, I'll comment on the name in a moment. We will serve this prayer or service of preparation usually before the beginning of Orthros. If we're running late or it's a longer service, we'll celebrate it during the Kathismata hymns during Orthros. Anyway, the point is this is really the preparation for the Divine Liturgy. It's not part of Orthros at all. It's called keros, right? There are two words essentially for time in ancient Greek, chronos and keros, right? Chronos means linear time, the way you and I experience time throughout our lives. Right? Keros means, at least as it's been understood in the context of our theology, this is really more the eternal time of God. It's tapping into the time of the kingdom, the time of the heaven. So, for example, when we talked about last time, when the deacon says to the priest or the bishop at the very beginning of the service, it is time for the Lord to act, that word time he uses is keros, not chronos. He doesn't mean it's the time on the watch to start liturgy, although the deacon will sometimes tell the priest and the bishop that. That's not what is going on in the service. What we're saying is we are now entering into the time of the kingdom, right? We're entering into eternity. So the service itself, I should say, bishops, you'll see, if you've ever watched a hierarchical orthros, you'll notice that when we get to the praises, the eni, the bishop will start it off, and then at some point they pause, and the chanters start singing this very long Ispola et Despota. And he comes to the middle of the solea, and the deacons are there holding the candles next to him. He's taking keros at that time. Okay? He's saying the entrance prayers. And on that day, only the bishop and his deacons say keros. The priests actually don't, because ultimately the bishop is the primary celebrant, right? So he's the one who says the keros in that moment. So, what is this service? It's also performed in front of the beautiful gate. By the way, the doors in the iconostasis, we all say so often that they're the royal doors. That is not true. It's just wrong. We do it too often in English. It's not what you call them in Greek, right? The royal doors are the doors in the back of the church the emperor came through. The middle doors in the back of the church. Those are the doors the emperor and the patriarch came through in Hagia Sophia. And if you'll notice, for example, you go down to Life-Giving Spring Monastery, for example, in the Catholicon, we never come in the middle door unless it's in the middle of a procession led by the clergy, right? We're always coming in the side doors. Those are the doors that are unlocked. Why? Because the middle door is the royal door. Those are the royal doors, the royal gate, okay? The gate on the iconostasis, and I even slip sometimes, but properly speaking, on the iconostasis, it's the beautiful gate. Okay, they're different doors. Anyway, and we do this not vested, wearing only the cassock, the zostiko, and the exoroson, the big long cassock, the one with the big sleeves. Why the big sleeves? Two things. First of all, the cassock itself, generally black, is considered a burial garb. It's to remind us that we are dead to the world. We've died to the world. And the exoroson has the big long sleeves, right? It has two purposes to that. One, it makes it really hard to do anything practical. And it's to remind us that in that moment we're supposed to be about the things of God and not the things of this world. So we can't work wearing an exoroson. The sleeves are too big, they get in the way. You should see me sometimes even just try to light the candles in the iconostasis with the things on them, knocking things over. But it's also, there's a line in the gospel where Christ talks about the Pharisees who make their phylacteries large and the borders of their garments broad, and accuses them of hypocrisy, right? We wear long sleeves, broad sleeves, as a reminder that we are sinful hypocrites. That we clergy are sinful hypocrites, and that's one of the primary reminders to us every time we go to serve. You're a sinner too. Right? Preach to yourself first. So, what does the service actually look like? We begin usually by bowing to the bishop's throne, okay? Because Father and I, for example, the priest and the deacon, our share of the priesthood is junior, and it is derivative of the bishop. It is through his authority that we serve and only with his blessing. So the first thing that we will do is go and bow to the bishop's throne. Then properly is 3 bows before the beautiful gate. Oh God, be merciful to me, a sinner. It's the first words that will come out of our mouth as part of this service, right? Then we begin with the basic Trisagian prayers that we're all familiar with. By the way, traditionally, the doors at this point remain closed on the beautiful gate. All right. And then we say the prayers of compunction. You may remember them from when we sing Paraklesis outside of the 14 days. Have mercy on us, O Lord, have mercy on us for laying aside all defense. We sinners offer unto thee as Master the supplication. Have mercy on us. Glory to the Father and the Son. And then when we get to the third, the priest and the deacon will trade off, or if the bishop is serving, he will say the first one, and then the deacons trade off. The third says, "Open unto us the doors of thy compassion, O blessed Theotokos," and continues. And at that moment, we open the beautiful gate, generally speaking. Now, a lot of priests will actually open it up before because they're probably starting orthros early or something like that. But in the full order, and you'll notice when the bishop is serving, when he comes out to start Keros, they'll close the doors. And then when they get to this hymn, "Open to us the doors of thy compassion, O Theotokos," they open the doors again. Okay. Then we say the Apologetia as we go and venerate the main icons: Christ, Panagia, St. John the Baptist, and then the feast day of the church. And we'll say the hymns of those icons as we venerate them. Then we come back, and there's a priest's prayer for strength, which I'll read in just a moment. We then bow to each other. The clergy will all bow to each other and ask forgiveness, and then bow to the people and ask their forgiveness before we begin. It's again a reminder from the church. If you come to the altar and find something against somebody, leave your gift at the altar and go be reconciled to them, right? So as part of the preparation prayers, we specifically stand there and bow and ask forgiveness of all before we begin. And then we will go in and we say prayers. We say, "In the multitude of thy mercy shall I go into thy house. I shall worship toward thy holy temple in fear of thee. How shall I, the unworthy one, dare to enter the brilliance of thy holy place? If I venture to enter into the bridal chamber, my garment will denounce me, for it is not a wedding garment, and I shall be cast out, bound by the angels. Cleanse, O Lord, the defilement of my soul, and save me, for thou art the lover of mankind." At that point, we bow in front of the altar 3 times, and we'll kiss the altar. I want you to see, though, the prayer that the priest says, or the bishop says, as part of this Keros. "Stretch forth thy hand, O Lord, from thy holy dwelling place on high, and strengthen me for thine appointed service, that standing without condemnation before thy fearful judgment seat, I may offer the bloodless sacrifice, for thine is the power and the glory unto the ages of ages. Amen." The first thing we see is that, remember we talked last time, that in the service it is the Lord acting. He's saying, "Lord, strengthen me and act through me," right? And then he's reminding, in the sense, himself, and the church is reminding him of what we're doing. We're standing before the very judgment seat in the throne room of the Lord, right? Making present the bloodless sacrifice of Christ. So it can actually be a very powerful reminder of what we're about to do. The church is making sure before we start, we know what we're doing. Right? I'm going to move into vesting prayers. Does anyone have questions about the entrance prayers, the preparation prayers specifically, before I go on? All right. Short. It takes about 3 minutes or so. Yeah.
I have a question. So I know, like today on Wednesday evening we have a pre-sanctified liturgy. So throughout the service, the gate opens and closes a couple of times.
Right.
You're gonna will you be touching upon that? So it's because it's different on Wednesday, right? It's not the same as Sunday.
What's going on is that as we are preparing the gifts, the curtain closes. And that's primarily what it is as Father is preparing the gifts on the discos, preparing the chalice, the curtain will close, because in a sense the gifts have not made their procession out to the people in the great entrance, right? And so in that moment, the curtain closes. I think it in a part, it's also that it adds simply to the overall feeling of the solemnity of the service. It is interesting, though, you asked for the pre-sanctified liturgy. Father and I take Keros very differently. None of these prayers are said. We come out in front and we go through and do all of the same actions, but the whole time, all we say is, through the prayers of our Holy Father, Lord Jesus Christ, our God, have mercy on us and save us. Amen. Okay? And that's all we say over and over again. Which is, maybe we can talk about this later. It's a prayer of monastic origin, and we're not actually praying for the prayers of the saints. You're praying for the prayers of the other clergy and the other monks, right? anyway, we'll get to that part of it. But the keros in the pre-sanctified liturgy becomes very, very stripped down and very simple, right? In keeping with the whole spirit of the service. Does that answer it a little bit?
Yeah,
okay.
Thanks.
All right. Any other questions before I move on? So, vesting. As you know, there are the three primary ranks of the clergy in the church: the deacon, the priest, and the bishop. We're going to build up from there, because in general, the vestments kind of build on each other as well as we go along. So, first and foremost, you have the deacon's vestments. And by the way, these are really cool. This is only used primarily, I've only ever seen it used on Mount Athos, Jerusalem, and Moscow. Maybe Mount Sinai. They call these zions, and they're large incense containers that during fancy vigils, the deacons will hold on their shoulders as they cense. It's really cool. I'll probably never get a chance to ever use one in my life, but it would be really cool. Anyway, some of them are nice, like in Moscow, they put an actual handle on the bottom of it. They're nicer to their deacons, I guess, in Mount Athos. But anyway, so the three basic vestments of the deacon are the sticarium, the epimanikia, and the orarium. So the sticarium, which is this main robe that you see, is actually worn by all three ranks of the clergy. And what it is, fundamentally, is the baptismal robe. It's the white robe spoken of in the book of Revelation, given to the righteous who are saved before the throne, which is, at least in part, the origin of why we wear white baptismal robes at our baptism. Right? And originally, that's what this garment, the sticarium, is. The prayer that is said, by the way, I should say, a deacon generally will not vest without a blessing from the bishop or the priest. So the bishop will bless his own vestments. If the bishop is there, the priest will get a blessing from the bishop to put his vestments on, and does not himself bless the vestments. If the bishop is not there, then having essentially taken keros from the bishop's throne, he will then bless his own vestments. The deacon does not bless. And so the deacon will take his vestments to the bishop or to the priest in general and say, "Bless, Master, the orarium and sticarium." Okay. Now, practically speaking, usually the bishop's at the throne, and I've got to run in and get vested to sense for orthros. And so he's giving the blessing from the throne to go in and vest. But it's the same point. So the prayer that we say as we put this on is, "My soul shall rejoice in the Lord, for he has clothed me with the garment of salvation, and with the robe of gladness has he encompassed me. As a bridegroom he hath set a crown upon me, and as a bride hath he adorned me with ornament, always, now, and ever, and unto the ages of ages. Amen." It is the wedding garment that we speak of in the gospel. It is the baptismal robe. Okay? Because it's the outer garment for the deacon, over time, deacons' sticaria have sort of become more embroidered and more embellished and a little bit fancier, right, than what we see with bishops and priests. The cuffs, the epimanikia, they're not actually wearing them in this picture. Maybe it wasn't such a good picture. I just like design. But the cuffs, there are separate prayers said for the right and for the left. The point of wearing them is twofold. It has a practical purpose in that it keeps the undersleeve out of stuff, right? Although it doesn't do a whole lot of good for us deacons. You'll see me sometimes when I'm preparing the gifts actually pull my sleeves up, right? But the other purpose is, most importantly, to remind us that it is no longer our hands acting. That when we bless, when we hold the gifts, and so on, these are not my hands anymore, but God's. With the right hand, we say, "Thy right hand, O Lord, is glorified in strength. Thy right hand, O Lord, hath shattered thine enemies." And in the multitude of thy glory hast thou crushed thine adversaries, always now and ever and unto the ages of ages. Amen. And then for the left hand, thy hands have made me and fashioned me. Give me understanding, and I will learn thy commandments, always now and ever and unto the ages of ages. Amen. Right? We're talking about his hands. Generally speaking, in the Greek Arab tradition, we only wear cuffs at divine liturgy. Okay? In the Slavic tradition, it is not uncommon that deacons will wear cuffs in any service. Vespers, Orthros, baptisms, whatever. If you're vested, you're wearing cuffs. The same for priests generally. Then finally the orarion, which is the stole or the sign of office, is really an old towel in part that was worn on the left shoulder. You'll notice they're wearing their orarion in the more traditional pattern than the way you see me wear mine. Originally, the deacon wore the orarion simply over the left shoulder. Okay? And in the Slavic tradition, when you're first ordained, you still only wear it on the left shoulder like this. Okay? What happened is over time, there was a second orarion given to those who were being elevated, the proto-deacons, the archdeacons. A sign of honor, you would get a second one, which you would button or clasp over here. And so you'd have one like this and one like this. Over time, they developed a way of, just make it really long, and you can wear it looped like that and have the same effect. And then over time, in the Greek and Arab tradition in particular, all deacons were given the honor of wearing the double orarion like that. Okay. But in some places you still see the older tradition preserved that you only wear it on the left shoulder unless you're being elevated. Right. The orarion, there are two prayers depending, there are two traditions about which prayer to say when putting it on. I actually end up saying both. The first is, he who desires to be great among you, let him be the servant of all. Okay. The second is, holy, holy, holy Lord of Sabaoth. Okay. The orarion in particular is meant to envision or meant to represent the wings of the angels. Okay. The broad sleeves and garment of the deacon is meant to represent the angelic garments. Okay. And so that's why, one of the reasons why, whenever a deacon is proclaiming anything, he will hold the orarion up. It is to image the angel's wings. It's also that in the ancient world, one of the ways that you would get somebody's attention if you had something to say was to raise your hand up. And it was a way of saying, hey, everybody, listen to me, right? And so you hold the orarion up both as and I actually knew a deacon who once commented, he said the other reason that you do it is, a lot of times deacons come from within the community. And sometimes you need to remind your buddies, hey, I'm not your buddy anymore, I'm a deacon, and so you hold it up. I don't know the historical veracity of all that, but it sure made us laugh. Anyway, any questions about the deacon's vestments? Yeah.
The cuffs, is it difficult because you tie them on, right?
Yeah, there's a string on the end, and you loosen it up, you put them on, and then basically you wrap the cord around and then tuck it in. Is basically how it goes. Everybody has their own little way of doing it, but yeah, you just wrap the cord around and tuck it in. Yeah. That's why you see us sometimes fussing, because it comes undone and we're trying to quietly, rewrap it in the middle of the service. Hopefully not that often. All right. So the priest vestments, is, by the way, Father Nectarios Papazafiropoulos, who's the chancellor of the archdiocese right now. Priests will wear the stichario, same vestment as we have, as the deacon wears, but it becomes a lot simpler. And you can actually see a little bit more with the priests and bishops the relationship to the baptismal garment, right? It's a lot more simple. Traditionally and historically, they were always white. And in some parts of the Orthodox world, they will still only wear a white staccato generally. In some places, it started to take on a complementary color or a similar color to the color of the vestments that they go with. That's a slightly later development. But even then, it will be lighter and generally shinier, again, to show that it is a baptismal garment. Priests wear the same cuffs. Their stole, so look at this. What would happen if we took the back part of his orarium and brought it around his neck and draped it in the front? And then, for ease, so that it didn't go flying around, you decided to button both sides together. You'd have the priest's epitrachelion, right? His stole. And that's exactly what would happen originally in the ordination of a deacon. The ordination of a priest. He'd have his cuffs already on. He'd wear that day a simpler staccato. And when the time came, they'd take his orarion and just wrap it right around his neck, and now all of a sudden you have a priest's stole. Over time, you find some stylized versions, like what Father Nectarios is wearing here, where it becomes just one piece of cloth. That's a later style, but it's the same point. Okay. The priest, as he puts on the staccato and the cuffs, he says the same prayer. For the epitrachelion, he says, "Blessed is God who pours out his grace upon his priests, as oil of myrrh upon the head, which runneth down upon the beard of Aaron, which runneth down to the fringe of his raiment, always now and ever unto the ages of ages. Amen." You'll notice it always comes down to the fringe of his garment. Right? There's an intentional imaging of these lines of scripture here as a reminder to the priest. Underneath, which you can't see, usually hidden by the philonion, the outer garment, is his belt, the zoni, which just has a very simple purpose, which is keep everything in place, right? The prayer for the belt is, "Blessed is God who girds me with power and has made my path blameless, always, now, and ever, and unto the ages of ages. Amen." Then, the philonion itself, the outer vestment of the priest, comes from the old Roman cloaks. There's actually a line in one of St. Paul's epistles where he says, "When you're at so-and-so's house, grab my philonion and bring it to me." He left it at somebody's house during his journeys, and he's saying, "Bring me my philonion." Okay? Originally, it was much longer in front. It was more like almost think more like a poncho, right? And what happened is, over time, for ease, it got shorter up front so that you would be able to work without it getting in the way. If you've ever seen Catholic priests, they have what's called a chasuble. It's the same vestment, basically. And you'll notice that for ease over time, the sides got shorter for them, and their arms come out through the side, but they keep it long in front. Same vestment, same point, which is make it easier for me to use my arms. We shorten the front, they shorten the sides. That's really what's going on there. And you'll find there are some that still will have their vestments made long in front in kind of that older style. They usually will put buttons up on top so that when it comes time to prepare the gifts, they button it up so that it's still out of their way. That's where it originally, that's how they started doing it, and then they eventually just cut the fabric off. That's where you get this style. You'll notice on here, I do not mention anything about the epigonation, right? And I don't say anything about the cross. Those are not priest vestments. Those are bishop vestments that, as a sign of respect and honor, the bishops will sometimes grant to certain priests as a way of honoring them. But it is not a priestly, a presbyteral garment. It is a bishop's garment, okay? Which brings us to the bishop's vestments. We all know this bishop. So, again, staccato, epimonikia, epitrahelion. For the epitrahelion, he says the same prayer except where it references priests, you say archpriest. Okay? But otherwise, same prayers here, same prayer for the zoni. Then the epigonation. Probably where this originates from was sort of like a satchel or a purse, essentially, that you would carry. But over time, it was seen to really resemble a sword. It's funny, people call it a shield, okay? That's not what the prayers call it at all. Because when the bishop puts it on, interestingly, the bishop generally does not say the prayers for his own vesting, the deacons say it. Gird thy sword upon thy thigh, O mighty one, in thy comeliness and in thy beauty, and proceed prosperously and be king because of truth and meekness and righteousness, and thy right hand shall guide thee wondrously, always, now and ever, and unto the ages of ages. Amen. It is a royal sword, the sword of a king, because there is an element of spiritual combat in what the bishop goes forth to do. It's also the sword with which we say, rightly dividing the word of your truth, right? He divides between what is right and what is wrong, what is just and unjust, all of these things. There's many places where we see a sword as being a symbol of judgment, in part hearkening back to Solomon, right? All of that imagery is at play with the epigonation. Practically speaking, when is it given to priests? Usually when they're given the blessing to your confessions, at least in the Greek and Arab tradition, right? In part because one of the jobs of the spiritual father is to engage in spiritual combat on behalf of their spiritual children and to divide between what is right and wrong, true and untrue, good and evil, right? So, the epigonation. Then the sakos instead of the phalonion. Originally, in general, bishops wore the phalonion, okay? And in certain icons you can still see, like in the three hierarchs, St. Gregory the Theologian and St. Basil the Great will be in a phalonion, and St. John Chrysostom is usually in a sakos. The sakos was at least in part an imperial vestment. It seems to have been granted at some point to the bishops in Rome and in Constantinople. And then over time, it expanded in other prominent bishops being allowed to use it. Interestingly, in the West, it was actually given to deacons as well. They call it a dalmatic, but it's essentially the same vestment. In the West, properly speaking, in the full vestments of a Western bishop, he would wear the dalmatic, the sakos, and put a phalonion over it. Anyway, or chasuble. But in the East, in general, the bishop would wear the phalonion. Over time, it started to kind of spread. And certainly by the late 14th century, 15th century, we see all of the bishops starting to wear the sakos. But that's sort of the origin of it, is really more of a kingly royal vestment. But when we put it on him, we say the same prayer as for the phalonion. Okay, but again, we say archpriest instead of priest, but otherwise the same prayer. Which is actually a liturgical indication that the bishop was wearing the same vestment, right? Because it's the same prayer, you're just changing it to archpriest. By the time these prayers were solidified, or rather by the time that the bishops all started wearing the sakos, the prayers had already been solidified, right? So they didn't change the prayer, but they're wearing a slightly different vestment for it. Then he wears the omophorion. Okay, this is this broad piece of fabric that he wears over everything. One might be tempted to think it looks like an orarium, like a deacon's orarium, but it's actually folded very differently. It has a very different origin, and it's much bigger. It is meant to represent a sheep over the shoulders of the shepherd, right? And you'll notice that at some point, for ease, the bishop will usually switch to a smaller version of that in the service, and you can see it even more directly because it's just hanging right like that. It's the sheep on his shepherd, on the shepherd's shoulders. And what happened to, and so the prayer that you say for the Omophorion is, when thou didst take upon thy shoulders human nature, which had gone astray, O Christ, thou didst bear it to heaven unto thy God and Father. This whole thing of bearing all of humanity as a sheep on the Good Shepherd's shoulders, right? Then for the cross, the pectoral cross, we say, whosoever will come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. And then the Engopion, which is the circular icon, usually of the Mother of God, but not always. He will say, create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me. Okay. Then we will put the mitre or the crown on him. And we say, he hath set upon thy head a crown of precious stones. Thou didst ask life of him, and he gave us the length of days. So it is the crown of the royal priesthood. And we'll actually give him, as we're finishing, after he's put the mitre on, we give him his staff, his paterisa, the pastoral staff. At which point we say, a scepter of power shall the Lord send unto thee out of Zion. Rule thou in the midst of thine enemies. So again, this sort of understanding of a royal priesthood, right? And then in a especially formal vesting, he will then give up the paterisa, okay? And he will pick up the candles here, and he will bless with them as we say, let thy light so shine before men that they may see thy good works and glorify thy Father in heaven. Right? Then he gives up the candles, takes back the staff, and we proceed out to the throne. Yeah, those are the vestments. Questions about the vestments? I'm going to talk about one other piece in just a moment. Yeah.
Kind of weird, but once a priest passes on, can the vestments go to another priest, or I mean, what do you guys do with them all?
Yeah, so first of all, one of those sets he's vested in and buried in his
Right.
vestments.
Right.
It's interesting because a deacon is not a celebrant. A deacon generally is buried only in a cassock. But priests and bishops are vested before they die, or I'm sorry, before they're buried, after they die. In fact, in the vesting of a bishop, after they've finished vesting him, they will actually seat him in the throne. Put the candles in his hand while the deacons or the priests hold it, and one last time proclaim, let thy light so shine before men that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven. And then they take the candles away from him and carefully lay him in the casket.
Wow.
Right. Depending on how things are, they'll either kiss his hand while he's still in the throne before they lay him in the casket, or after they've laid him in the casket, they will come and kiss his hand. There is a tradition, though, the Engopion, that the bishop is vested with for his burial is not the Engopion that he actually is buried with. Just before the casket is closed, a bishop is given the honor of removing his Engopion and putting his own Engopion on the bishop, and then wears from then on that bishop's Engopion, or keeps it as his own. Right? I know I actually heard about it with Metropolitan Anthony. It was Bishop Anthemos, because he was so close to him. That before Metropolitan Anthony was buried, Anthemos was given the honor by the Archbishop of going and taking his Engopion. Interestingly, with Metropolitan Anthony, he was not embalmed, and his body was loose. He never had rigor mortis, much like the monks that you see in a lot of the monasteries. He repented and prayed very hard in his final days. I heard Bishop Anthemos telling me in Anthony's final days, he kept the phone going nonstop, calling every single person he could think of that he'd ever offended and begging their forgiveness. Anyway, an incredible honor. As for their other vestments, yes, they might be donated to missions or to poorer priests or whatever. Or if the priest has, for example, family members who are priests,
Yes.
it might be given to the family members, whatever the case may be.
So while you're alive, do you share your vestments across priest to priest?
I mean,
or-
yeah. In some form or another, sure.
My dad's donated his to like younger priests.
Okay.
Like he
Yeah.
still has got some, but
Yeah.
now that he's retired, he's donated, I guess, to younger priests.
Here's an amazing story. So the pictures that we have of now Archbishop Opiloforos,
Yes.
then Deacon Ioannis, serving here with Metropolitan Anthony Holy Week of 2004.
Yes.
He's wearing a set of white vestments. He, at that time, was a professor at the seminary on loan for one semester. When he went back to Constantinople, he forgot that set of vestments at the seminary. That set of vestments, nobody knew whose it was. And my friend, Deacon Angelo, somebody else found them. They were about to be thrown away.
Oh.
And gave them, not knowing whose they were. They were just like, oh, we got all these extra things that people kind of leave here over the years. We're just going to get rid of it. So he found it, gave it to my friend Deacon Angelo in Long Beach. The Archbishop sees him wearing it and says, I know those vestments, those are my vestments. And so Deacon Angelo sent it back to him recently. This was all just the last couple of months. He was like,
Wow.
wait a minute, where did you get that set of vestments? I think those are mine. He says, yeah, somebody was throwing them away at the seminary. Right. Pretty remarkable, you know. But yeah, if a priest is visiting, and he doesn't have vestments, here, just wear mine, right?
Okay.
Sometimes in big cathedrals or monasteries, they might have a set of a particular type where everybody who's going to serve wears the same.
Right.
Just like the deacons that we saw here, right? They're wearing, that's a set the monastery has.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, however it works. I heard a beautiful story actually this week of Father Gregory Koob, who's the chaplain now at the Monastery of the Life-Giving Spring. Before that, he was in St. Basil's in San Jose. When he first came to this country, they had nothing. I mean, they were dirt poor. They had nothing. He had no vestments, right? He was a priest, but when he came here from Greece, he had nothing. So much so, they were so out of their element. My understanding is they rented like an apartment, not even realizing that the floor above them and the floor below them were brothels. They didn't even realize like where they were. They were so poor. He goes to a liturgy where he hears Elder Ephraim is going to be. And as soon as he walks in the door, somebody comes and grabs him and says, the elder's asking for you. The elder had told somebody in the altar, go bring me my Korean priest. Right? Had no idea that he was coming. They'd never met, nothing, right? He goes into the altar, the elder talks with him, finds out that he has no vestments and gives him his own vestments. And so many of the vestments that Father Gregory wears to this day are the vestments that Elder Ephraim gave him, however many decades ago. So yes, they will share in various circumstances. Other questions? Yeah.
When you vest the bishop, is there like one priest says one prayer and does a certain?
Properly speaking, the first and the second deacon trade off. So at the very beginning, the deacon will say, the first deacon says, bless Master. The bishop says, blessed is our God, always now and ever, and unto the ages of ages, amen. First deacon says, let us pray to the Lord. Second deacon says, Lord have mercy. First deacon reads the prayer for the Sacrarium. Second deacon finishes it with now and ever and unto the ages of ages, amen. Then the second deacon will say, let us pray to the Lord. First deacon says, Lord have mercy. Second deacon then says the prayer for the Epitrahelion. and back and forth, right? We just trade off back and forth.
So the priests don't do that?
Nope.
It's just the deacons? Okay.
If there is deacons, even a deacon, and there is a bishop, priests have a liturgical holiday. They have no role other than to do what the bishop tells them to do, and otherwise they do nothing. It's the deacons and the bishop that serve.
Wow.
Which is in part a reminder that we as deacons, Father Nico will often remind me this. I'll make a comment that, I'm his deacon. And he says, no, you're not. You're the bishop's deacon. He is allowing you to serve with me, but you're the bishop's deacon. And he's right. Yeah.
Another question, so how is any of this different? For example, this Friday during the salutations, we're expecting, God willing,
Right.
Bishop
Erasmus, yeah.
So how is this, because it's not the...
Right, because that's just an apodipno, right?
Okay.
So there's no keros, and there's not really any vesting. So the priest will, wear the epitrachelion,
Okay.
and he'll bless it and say the prayer. Although here, he won't even put that on. He'll wait for the bishop to come. We greet him.
Mhm.
The bishop will be simply in his exorason, his engopion, and either the bastuni, the small staff, right? Or he might have the pateritsa. He could wear the mandias, which is just a long, fancy cloak.
Mhm.
And that's it,
Okay.
right? When the bishop comes down, if he decides to come, and he'll just be at the throne the whole time. If he decides to come down and to do some of the haridismi, then he might put the omophorion, both an epitrachelion and an omophorion on. But otherwise, none of this stuff goes on in one of those
Yeah.
services. Yeah. The final piece of this, then, this is the last part of it, because I know I've been going for longer than I planned, is the washing of the hands. The clergy will wash their hands. If it's the bishop, somebody else washes his hands. Properly speaking, it's the subdeacon who does it. In the absence of the subdeacon, if there's an altar boy already ready, they will do it. Otherwise, usually I will do it as the deacon. But properly speaking, it is the subdeacon's job. And we say from Psalm 25, I will wash my hands in innocency, and I will compass thine altar, O Lord, that I may hear the voice of thy praise, and tell of all thy wondrous works. Lord, I have loved the beauty of thy house, and the place where thy glory dwelleth. Destroy not my soul with the ungodly, nor my life with men of blood, in whose hands are iniquities, their right hand is full of bribes. But as for me and mine innocence have I walked. Redeem me, O Lord, and have mercy on me. My foot hath stood in uprightness, and the congregations will I bless thee, O Lord. Originally, this was actually done at the great entrance, just before the great entrance. And you'll notice with a bishop, it's still done there. But we'll nevertheless do it as well before the beginning of the liturgy. We will wash our hands. Any other questions about the vesting or the preparation? I think the point that we can take away from this is all of these things, right, are ultimately done to remind us of the spiritual state that we must be in when we serve and when we are in the liturgy. And while it may be more formalized for the clergy, all of us as Christians are called to have the same preparation for it. And that's hopefully what we can take away. Yes, the vestments and so on beautify the service for us. We like seeing them. Okay, maybe not as much with some sets, but right? But we like seeing them. They make it more beautiful. It accentuates everything. But really, it's a reminder to us as the clergy and also to the people of the reality of what is occurring and the state of our soul that we should be striving for at all times when we serve. Okay. Any other questions? All right, why don't we end with a prayer then? Lord of the powers, be with us, for in times of distress we have no other help but you. Lord of the powers, have mercy on us.